How to fish a pond for beginners. This video shows my process for pond fishing in a way that maximizes chances of finding and catching any bass lurking in the depths. I've found having a targeted pond approach with the right equipment reduces wasted time, improves enjoyment, and ultimately catches more bass. In this video, I cover common pond types, my recommended strategies for finding bass in these ponds, recommended baits and lures, and tips and tricks that will help you catch more bass. Our first section is common pond types and how they affect the optimal fishing approach. Ponds are small bodies of water that, for the most part, are only accessible to bank fishing or kayaks and canoes. They are usually shallow, and for many of us, may be man-made neighborhood ponds. The key differences in ponds that affect pond fishing strategy are pond depth and size, amount of submerged vegetation, amount of bank vegetation, bank access, and cover, or lack of cover. Now, let's jump into the actual strategies. I'll start off with a few key principles, then talk through a couple specific examples that likely reflect conditions of one or more ponds near you. If it's my first time at a pond, my strategy focuses on the following. 1. Cover water trying to find a pattern. Time is limited, and I want to find a winning pattern as fast as possible. 2. Prioritize traditionally fishy spots. Fish seek areas offering safety and food. Cover, like laydowns, weed beds, and dock pilings, tend to hold more fish because they provide a place to hide both the bass and their targeted prey. Prioritize cast to structure over open water if possible. 3. Adapt to signs and conditions. It's hard to tell what's going on underwater from the bank. Look for signs like a high concentration of bait on one side of the pond or birds actively feeding, because this can give away a fishing hotspot. Additionally, conditions like high concentrations of weeds or abnormally dirty water after a rain may necessitate a change in bait or strategy. Now, let's cover how to apply this strategy to a couple different pond types. Pond number 1, your classic man-made neighborhood pond. Key features include open banks with minimal or no vegetation, shallow, commonly 6 feet or less at its deepest, limited underwater structure, limited surface structure, and may or may not have submerged weeds. Many of us have access to this type of classic mowed grass neighborhood pond. They may look barren on the outside, but many of these ponds hold good numbers of bass. Because of the open conditions combined with limited obvious structure, there's frequently nothing immediately obvious that looks like it's congregating fish. In this scenario, I like to use a moving bait to cover water. I don't know what depth may be holding bass, or if a specific end of the pond has some hidden structure that I'm not aware of. Instead of starting with a super slow bait like a wacky worm, on my first trip to this type of pond, I'm usually casting something that relatively quickly lets me circle the whole pond to unlock useful nuggets of information. Recommended baits to start with are moving baits like spinnerbaits, crankbaits, chatterbaits, or topwater wake baits. I like to loop the pond, alternating between casting parallel to the shoreline and 45 degrees off the shoreline. The reason behind the 45-degree angle is that my bait will cover multiple water depths on a single cast. Frequently, bass will be in a certain type of structure. For example, a weed bank that starts at 3 feet deep, and casting like this is a great way to search for a pattern. After looping the lake, I run through a mental flowchart, starting with, did I catch a fish? If yes, do more of whatever worked. If all my bites were 20 yards off the bank, target 20 yards off the bank. If all my bites were up shallow, target shallow. If I didn't catch a fish, I'm thinking about 3 main things. Either the bass are in a different part of the pond, they didn't like the bait I was throwing, or this pond doesn't have a healthy bass population. My experience is getting any bait near a fish is more important than getting the optimum bait near fish. If you got no bites whatsoever when working around a pond, it's more likely the fish are somewhere else versus you needed a prettier bait. My recommendation is to change it up and try to get into the deeper part of the pond with a finesse presentation. At this point, I'm thinking about swapping to a drop shot, shaky head, or a Texas rigged soft plastic and targeting the deepest part of the pond. Since this type of pond is usually bowl-shaped, the deepest part is generally as far as you can cast into the middle of the pond. Similar to starting with shallow moving baits, I would then circle the pond trying to cover the deep parts to find feeding fish or a pattern. I like this two-pronged strategy because it efficiently breaks down a pond to find a winning pattern and exclude any non-winning patterns. If I made it around a pond with a moving bait and tested the deeper portions of water with a finesse bait without getting bit, I'm probably thinking to try a different pond. While many neighborhood ponds hold good numbers of bass, there are some that just aren't great fishing. The trick is to get out there, try different strategies, and learn something new each trip. Alright, so that covers how I'd approach a standard neighborhood pond. Next up is the other end of the spectrum, a natural pond with more vegetation, potentially more fish, but also different challenges. But first, if you're finding these recommendations helpful and want to round out your skills as an angler, check out our website for a free digital download of a knot tying ebook that includes easy reference diagrams showing how to tie the most critical fishing knots for terminal tackle, connecting leaders, and anything in between. Link in the description. Pond 2 is a natural pond with, potentially, much more going on. Key features include restricted bank access. Vegetation may limit bank access or casting ability. Shallow, but may have additional depth changes. Potential underwater structure like brush piles, submerged logs, or rock piles. Significant surface structure like laydowns, docks, or trees. And likely has submerged weeds. Pond 2 is what I would describe as a fishy-looking pond. Natural, overgrown ponds tend to have way more life than man-made neighborhood ponds. The ecosystem probably has more forage for all levels of the food chain, and a pond like this is pretty likely to hold bass. On this type of pond, I want to start with the same strategy of casting moving baits 45 degrees from the shore to find feeding bass, but specific limitations like poor bank access may keep this strategy short-lived. There's a large pond near where I live that is so overgrown with trees and vegetation that there are only 2 spots along the entire shoreline where I can even make a cast. For more natural ponds like this, I adapt my strategy as follows. For limited bank access, use a slower bait like a Texas rig soft plastic, wacky worm, or drop shot on the few areas you can fish. If these are the only spots that are fishable, you can at least fish them thoroughly. For heavy structure ponds, cast near anything that may be hiding a bass. Laydowns, brush piles, and weed lines can all hold bass. If the submerged vegetation is so overgrown that most baits get snagged immediately, switch to something like a topwater frog that can handle the conditions. While trying this strategy out, you should keep an eye out for any patterns and key in on those patterns. For example, if you catch fish in the shade, look for other shady spots to cast to. These 2 examples cover the extremes of pond fishing. Adapt these strategies to your specific fishing conditions as appropriate. Next, we have a few general pond fishing tips that will help you catch more fish. 1. Try not to spook fish. Pond fishing is up close and personal. Loud noises and fast movement can spook bass. Move slowly and quietly and try to cast ahead of where you're walking instead of behind. 2. Learn from each trip. Each pond is different. Try to pick up nuggets of information from each trip that may be useful for next time. 3. While we've all heard stories of lunker bass in ponds, the average bass size in most ponds is smaller than in bigger bodies of water. A general rule of thumb is to downsize your baits to match the size of your prey. And 4. Pond fish in popular ponds get quite a bit of pressure. They learn quickly that certain baits are not good to chase. For example, we were fishing this clear pond in Wisconsin, and on our first few casts with this wake bait, bass were coming from 10 yards or further to check it out. After a few casts and missed strikes, they mostly started ignoring the bait. Keep in mind that new, novel presentations may help catch more bass on your local pond. I recommend a few key accessories for pond fishing that will make your life much easier. First is a pair of polarized sunglasses. Polarized sunglasses significantly cut down the glare on the surface of the water and improve your ability to spot underwater structure or even swimming fish, which are both super useful for pond fishing. 2. Some kind of fishing backpack to carry your supplies. Effective pond fishing requires you to be mobile, and it's nice to have everything with you at all times. I've been using and enjoying this Cast King carry-all backpack that has plenty of internal storage space, but more importantly to me, rod holders and plenty of storage for accessories on the exterior of the backpack. 3. Think about long pants and waterproof boots to protect yourself from bugs and plants if you have difficult bank access. 4. Pliers in case you have a deep hook set. Always have pliers just in case you need one to safely unhook a bass and get it back in the water quickly. And finally, a selection of baits to let you adapt to the conditions of the pond. I've included links to some of my gear recommendations in the description. In summary, I like a strategy focused on covering water to find a pattern, targeting traditionally fishy spots like submerged structure, and adapting to any signs and conditions indicating I should change bait or strategy. In practice, the first time I try a new pond, I'm usually starting with a moving bait, casting 45 degrees from the bank, and covering water. If that doesn't work, I swap to a finesse presentation and target deeper water. If it's the second or third time at a pond, I try to start with the tidbits I learned from the earlier trips, like I caught a few bass at the mouth of a creek or along a weed line, so I would start there. That's my strategy for breaking down ponds to catch more bass. Let me know in the comments your favorite tips and tricks for pond fishing for bass.